Okay,
All right.
Lee, you can
All
introduce
right.
yourself and go for it.
All right. I'm Lee Miller, congregational leader in Richmond, Virginia, House of David Fellowship. My website is houseofdavidfellowship.com. We are currently going through the book of Acts. Actually, tomorrow I'll be doing chapter 21. I thought that as a good prep for some of the things that are in the book of Acts, that we would go through Acts 15. It took us 3 months to go through Acts 15 in the assembly because there's so much material there. So after giving some thought, I thought that this might be a good place to do it. So we're going to be sharing the introduction to that. I'm going to build a foundation so that I can start building on the walls the next time that I have an invitation to be able to speak. So without further ado, let me click the button. All right. I hope that everybody can see the page there, and I'm going to see if I can advance the slides. I can. Okay, here we go. This is Acts 15, and breaking it down, I'm going to, as I said, prepare some foundational statements so that you can have a place to build on. One of the things that we talked about in our assembly was there are things that are controversial in the scripture, some in Torah, other parts of Tanakh, and some New Testament stuff. And I wondered, is this the most controversial chapter in the Bible? And so I asked for some other people's inputs. It was kind of interesting discussion. The second thing, I thought this was pretty interesting. Does the problem they're trying to solve in the first century really apply to us today? Interesting question. Anybody have a Gezerah Sheva? If you know how to cook this, then you need to send me your recipe. Okay, we'll be talking about that. First up, a quick run through Acts 15, 1 through 29. We only do verses 1 through 29 because that's the main part of the chapter that we need to discuss. A stop off at Emmanuel Tov. We're going to talk about a book that he wrote a couple decades ago that is going to help us understand what is going on in the text of Acts 15. And then there's going to be some other challenges that we're going to find along the way, including the Council of Trent back in, I think, 1530, but at least sometime in the 16th century. We may touch on that, not today, but we are going to go through it. All right, so Acts 15:1, some men came down from Judea, began teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom, you cannot be saved. And verse 5, oh yes, I should let you know that I don't always follow the chronological order of a chapter. But there rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. So we can see the 2 points that are there. There's a Messianic rabbi that I have minimum relationship with, actually through a friend of mine over in Israel. His name is Bob Gorlick. And I read some of his material on the subject, so I quoted him, and I want to read this quote to you. There was never a question among Jews whether or not Gentiles could be saved. The question was always how they get saved. The other thing that is important is understanding the profound difference between what Christians think of when the word saved is used and what Jews think. For Jews, being saved means connected to the covenant that God made with the Jewish people. Continue with that. There in the first century, most Jews believed that Gentiles must convert to Judaism in order to be saved. In other words, that's what they were taught, so that's what they knew. The men who came down from Judea to Antioch in verse 1 were typical, not atypical, of the larger Jewish community. See, that's what's important there. I know that in my previous religion, I was taught that the Pharisees who came down were evil. They were against what was going on, etc. They were the bad guys. No, they were the status quo, and their concern was to make sure the Gentiles would make it into the next age, the seventh day. That was their concern, and because they had been taught that you have to become a convert to Judaism to be able to do that, we've got a problem. These people, okay, God's touching them. That's great, fine, wonderful. But they still have to convert to Judaism in order to make it into the seventh day. This is what they were taught. That's all they were asking. That was the question. So the discussion between James, Paul, and Peter, and there were some others there too, we'll probably touch on that, clearly establishes several principles regarding the Gentiles and salvation. So like I said, I'm just setting up some things, some foundation, and some questions. Continuing with Bob's quote, they really boil down to a single one. Gentiles are no more unclean by virtue of their being Gentiles than Jews are clean by virtue of their being Jews. This is Acts 10. Therefore, Jews and Gentiles are both saved in the same way through the grace of our Lord Yeshua. Verse 11 of this chapter. All right, to 2. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them because they were seeing it differently. That's interesting. They had this insight before Acts 15. Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some of the other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. Isn't that so cool? There's a question. People disagreed, so they got together and they decided to go up to Jerusalem. I like it. Apostles, elders came together to consider the matter. It's a shame it doesn't work that way today, huh? And when they had been much disputing, Peter rose up and said, men and brethren, you know how that a good while ago God made choice among us that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe. Of course, this is Acts 10. And God, who knows the heart, bore witness to them, giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he also did to us. Now, that's interesting. He did not discriminate between us and them, which is what the Jews do. He purified their hearts by faith. And 10, therefore, why tempt God to put a yoke on the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? So, I've highlighted tempt and yoke. We're going to look at those words in just a minute. But I think it's interesting that what Peter is talking about here, I know how it gets twisted because I was there 25 years. I know how it gets twisted. But in a re-examination of it from additional perspectives, we'll see that that was not correct. So the tempting of God and yoke on the disciples that nobody's able to keep is a hint. The word tempt from Freiberg, in a bad sense of a person's hostile intent toward God, also in a bad sense of enticement to sin. And this is Exodus 17:2, very familiar passage. The people did chide with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. Moses said, why do you chide with me and why do you tempt Yahweh? That's the same word just from the Greek Old Testament. And yoke, the second word that was highlighted in our verse back then, Freiberg, figuratively in the New Testament of any binding burden, strict requirements, heavy obligations. But the problem here with that definition is that if you remember Yeshua, he said, my yoke is easy. So a yoke, even though a yoke exists, it can be easy or it can be hard, and you get to pick which one you want. I think that's also wonderful. Okay, so Galatians 5:1 and 2 uses that word. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Now, some people say that's the law, but obviously it can't be. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if you're circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. And yet, in 16:3, Paul circumcised one of the disciples. So obviously, they can't be talking about that. I know this is outside the scope, but I'm just bringing up these things. So it may say yoke of bondage or heavy yoke or some other yoke. We have to understand what's being talked about and what's not being talked about. Otherwise, we're going to go down a wrong path. Parties that will probably need to be addressed. These are some of the other leaders, we'll use the word leaders in this community, that I wanted to take a look at to see what they were saying. Tim Hague, First Fruits of Zion, Resnick, Lancaster, Lehman, he's a blogger, Juster's a book writer, and Cantor, and there's probably some others too. I've read all of these guys' works. I've looked at the things they've covered. I've looked at the things they haven't covered. I'm trying to cover the things they haven't covered. There could be some others as well. All right, let's continue. But we believe it is through the grace of our Lord Yeshua that we are saved just as they are. So here we have I'm going to say almost a summation statement that however the Gentiles are going to come into the covenant is how the Jews are coming into the covenant. I think this is interesting. Now, I'm bringing to your attention a Greek word that's going to show up in verse 16. It's the word for build, and it happens to be the same word that shows up in 16:18 when Yeshua was talking about, I will build my ecclesia. And over time, we will be breaking those things down, and I'll show you a chart here in a minute that I created for that. And Romans, this is a Pauline passage here. They are not all Israel, which are of Israel, which I have always understood that you have those people who are part of the covenant with Israel. You know, maybe they are blood relatives coming down from Abraham. But the thing is that there's also an Israel, which is the remnant, the ecclesia that Yeshua built. That's how I always understood this verse. Verse 12, then the multitude kept silent and gave audience to Barnabas and Paul, declaring what miracles and wonders God had wrought among the Gentiles by them. 13, and after they held their peace, James steps up and begins to speak. Men and brethren, hearken unto me. Did you ever notice that the Hebraic name of Peter is used in the text there? Even when you look at the Greek, you'll notice that it's a transliteration from the Hebrew. I always thought that was interesting. I don't know why, but I'm just saying it's there. Simeon has declared how God at the first did visit the Gentiles, Acts 10, to take out of them a people for his name. And to this agree the words of the prophets. This is the most important statement in the New Testament. It occurs in a number of places. People will be looking to the prophets to find out, because it's based on Amos chapter 3. God says, I don't do anything except I tell the prophets first. So if he's doing something, then he told the prophets. If somebody thinks this is something that God's doing and he didn't tell the prophets, probably didn't do it. For me, it's a very simple thing. So here, just like it was in Acts 2, and last week as I covered, not last time I was on here that I covered in Acts 20, the prophets speak to these things and they're very clear. And so this is what James is getting ready to do. And I bet you he did this in his study. And now he's coming out with this 2-verse sermon that's bigger than you might think. But anyway, so 15, to this agree the words of the prophets. So from 6 years ago, this was in July of 2011, I had to create a chart to help the people in the assembly understand what was going on with the text in the first century. So I called it the A train and the B train, and I'm going to have a chart here that I created in a moment that's going to help you see how this breaks down. What is the Hebrew manuscript called that our English Bibles are translated from? It's called the Masoretic text. But you notice that you would think the Masoretic text is the Hebrew text. It's like it's one text, but here's the problem. It's not one text. It is a family of texts, of which no two agree. It's a whole bunch of Hebrew texts of Tanakh that exist, and no two agree. So it's the Masoretic family, and you're going to see exactly how this unfolded. I'm going to show you, and I'm going to quote. Textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. This was written by Emmanuel Tov. As I said, we're doing a site of Tov. Over here I have MT as a Masoretic text, and I have the letter M as the picture of what that looks like. For LXX, I have G, which is the Septuagint. That is the Greek text of Tanakh. And AS is the Apostolic Scriptures, and I have the letter Q. And over time, we'll unfold that. But I'm going to show you from Emmanuel Tov's book. This is the book. This is the book that is used if you go to a postgraduate college to get a master's or a PhD and you're studying the Hebrew Bible. This is the book you will read. So this is the book I'm quoting. My library had it, so I got it out. So here's the table of contents. And what I want to highlight is when we get to verse 2, to page 2, this is how early in this book this is, the need for the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. Yeah, right. Then, on page 11, in many details, the Masoretic text does not reflect the original text of the biblical books. Yeah. All right, so let's take a look. This is the page. Let me show you what we're dealing with. Page 2, the biblical text has been transmitted in many ancient and medieval sources, which are known to us from modern editions in different languages. And you've seen this. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls had Hebrew, but there's some other versions in different languages that have been found through archaeology over the last 1,000 years. And so we have these sources, as well as what goes back to before the 1st century. We now have manuscripts in Hebrew and other languages from the Middle Ages and ancient times, as well as fragments of leather, papyrus scrolls, 2,000 years old or more. That's pretty old. These sources, we're still on page 2, shed light on and witness to the biblical text. So they're called textual witnesses. Here's the thing. All these textual witnesses differ from each other to a greater or lesser extent. You would think, well, that'd be great. Okay, so this says the exact same thing as this. No, it doesn't. Since no textual source contains what could be called the biblical text, a serious involvement in biblical studies clearly necessitates the study of all sources, including the differences between them. Not an easy task. That's why it's so great to have an assembly where you have 10 or 20 families come together and you have certain peoples with certain sets of skill, and each one brings to the table that gift and that skill that they have. So these things get discussed and we work through it and we end up with homework and we go do it and then we come back to share what we found, because it's a big topic. There's a whole lot of big topics and one person isn't going to do them all. It ain't going to happen. So you have to get together. That's what we do in our assembly. Okay, here's the next page I want to cover. Page 3. One would not have expected differences between the printed editions of the Hebrew Bible. Printed, okay? If a fully unified textual tradition would have been possible at any one given period, it would certainly seem to be after the invention of printing, which is a few centuries ago. But alas, this is not the case. Some editions differ from each other in the subsequent printing. And here's my problem. This is why I've highlighted the text. I've looked at these printed editions and they differ from each other and they don't inform the reader. If you don't know it's different, you don't even know it's different. There's no footnote, there's no asterisk, there's no italics, there's nothing there. They just change the text and they don't tell you. I have a problem with that. Page 11 heading, we saw this in the table of contents. In many details, the Masoretic text does not reflect the original text of the biblical books. Remember, I didn't write this. It has become clear from the preceding paragraphs that one of the postulates of biblical research is that the text preserved in the various representatives of what is commonly called the Masoretic text does not reflect the original text of the biblical books in many details. All right? Let me translate that into English. At page 11, we've gone through quite a few paragraphs. And one of the things that they're putting out there for consideration is the text preserved in various representatives. Going back to the paragraph that said there's a whole bunch of textual witnesses that make up the family called the Masoretic text. After they've gone through all of them, they're like, wow, these do not really reflect the original text in many details. Shocking, I know. Even were we to surmise that the Masoretic text reflects the original form of the Bible, that's completely different from the original text, the form of the Bible, we'd still have to decide which Masoretic text reflects the original text, since it's represented by a whole bunch. So it would be like having the KJV and the NAS and the NIV and the ASV and the who knows what other alphabet soup Bible translation you're going to have, and lining them all up and going through verse by verse and go, oh, look, verse 4 is different in these two. That's what we got here with all of these Hebrew manuscripts. And this is manageable, but we're getting to the problem, okay? The Masoretic text, sometimes called the received text, is strictly speaking a medieval, that tells you the date this was decided. It's 11th century, if you want to know. Representative of a group of ancient texts. Medieval representative of a group of ancient texts. This means that there was a whole bunch of texts, and they picked one. Okay, they picked one. Out of all these texts, they said, okay, this one is going to be the one we're going with. Okay, strictly speaking, medieval representative of a group of ancient texts of the Bible, which already at an early stage was accepted as the sole text by a central stream of Judah. What does that mean in English? That means that Rabbinical Judaism chose a specific text that they were going to go with as the received text. And from that point on, all English Bibles would be translated from the Hebrew of that specific text the rabbis chose into the English that you read. That's what that means in English. Page 19. Because of its place in Judaism as the central text of the Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text also became the determinative text for the Hebrew Bible of Christianity and the scholarly world. That's what I said using different English words. All printed editions of the Bible contain M. When this was written, that probably was true, but there are some new editions of the Bible that are coming out that don't rely solely on the Masoretic text. So that's important to know. Nevertheless, Masoretic text reflects merely one textual tradition out of many that existed in the period of the First and Second Temple. Now, think about the dates. The Masoretic text was chosen in the 11th century. That's 10x, whatever it is, 1052, 1014. The one that gets translated into English for us. But there's been a text that's been coming along since the First and Second Temple. We're not going to get into that because that's a little outside the scope. But what I'm doing is allowing you to understand why the text that we're going to study in Acts 15 doesn't agree with the Hebrew to English translation in any Bible. That's what I'm setting this up for. Page 24. The preference for the Masoretic text by a central stream in Judaism called Rabbinic Judaism does not necessarily imply that it contains the best text. Of course, you don't know this, so you don't even get a choice. You don't even get an opinion. You're just given your English Bible, and you just expect it to be right. So you have no idea what took place in the back rooms when they decided this, the editorial committees and how they translated it, all of that stuff. You don't know anything about that. You have no input. You just show up with your English Bible, and there you go. That's what you got. Well, we don't do that in Virginia anymore. All right. Both the Hebrew parent text of G, that's the Greek Septuagint, and look what it says. It's not talking about the Septuagint. It didn't say the Septuagint text. It said the Hebrew parent text of the Greek, and certain Qumran texts reflect excellent text, often better than that of the Masoretic text. So, once again, in English, what we have here is there was a Hebrew text that existed in which the scholars at that time period translated that Hebrew into the Greek text, which we have today, which has been existing for over 2,000 years, which was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which they used in the 1st century and 2nd century. We may touch on a little bit of that here and there. This is saying the Hebrew text that the Greek was translated from and certain of the Qumran texts, which turn out to be of the same family, are different than the Masoretic text. And that's where the problem lies. And most Bibles do not tell you this. All right, here's my graphic. In the beginning, there was Ezra. And then there was the A train and the B train. On the A train side, Hebrew, the A train Hebrew, out of that came the Septuagint text, And out of that came the apostolic text. Out of the B train became the Masoretic text. So you got the A train Hebrew and the B train Hebrew. Now there was one Hebrew with Ezra, but then over time changes took place. So I call them the A train and the B train. Another thing that is outside the scope, but it's good to know, is that if you read the Jewish literature of the late 1st century and early 2nd century, the Jews were losing a lot of arguments because the Jews under rabbinic authority were losing a lot of arguments because the Jews who were following Yeshua were using a different text, and frequently those that were not in Jerusalem were using the Greek text that was available. Well, the Greek text, of course, agreed with the A train Ezra, not with the B train that they were using. So what the rabbis decided was they were going to create 3 new Greek texts to fight against the Greek text that already existed. So like I said, it's outside the scope, but that's what they did. Those are the names. Now, this particular graphic is from a book that I used, one of the books that I used when I was studying the subject. The left column is the Greek text that comes from Acts 15, the verses that James said. In the middle column is the Greek text of Amos, which is the foundational text that is used here. And in the right column is the Masoretic text. And you can't tell it here unless you're fluent in Hebrew and Greek, but the Masoretic text does not agree on the key points with the Greek text. All right, so just saying. Now, this is the chart that I created because what I wanted to do is I wanted to take what James said and I wanted to line it up with what Amos said, because Amos is the prophet. And if you remember, what did James say? As he's starting to talk, and he says, and this agrees with what the prophet says. Well, then, you know what the first question is that all of us ask? Well, what did the prophet say? Well, let's go find out what the prophet said. So that's what I wrote. I created this chart to show me what the prophet said in relationship to what James said. So I've broken it up into 7 parts, and you can see that they do not agree. Sometimes things are left out, some things are added, some things are changed. And there's a reason for all of this. And so what I do, but not tonight, but what we're going to do over this series on just Acts 15 is we're going to break down not only what Amos said, but all the other texts, which I'm going to name in a moment, all the other biblical and non-biblical texts that James quotes in Acts 15, we're going to name and look at. Okay? But anyway, this is the chart I created that we'll be using. All right, so here we go. These 3 verses equal the following text. Got the Amos, which is the foundation, also Hosea 3 and Jeremiah 12, Isaiah 45, 56, Lamentations 2, Psalm 42, and if you look it up in the Greek, it's 41. Amos 5, also the, this is a Dead Sea Scroll document here. Zechariah, 2 Samuel 7, Exodus 15. Okay, now we're getting into more of the Dead Sea Scroll text. This is 4Q Florilegium, which is in the 4th cave. First Enoch, we're all familiar with Enoch. Tobit, another Apocrypha, and the Jubilees. All of those were part of the discussion that showed up in Acts 15, 16 through 18. How cool is that? Okay? So, these are things that we're going to look at when we get there. Now, let's continue with verse 20 here. But we write unto them that they abstain from 1, 2, 3, 4 things. 21 says, where does this come from and what does it mean? I'm sorry, not 21. I asked this question because I wanted people to understand the role of a ger in the Hebrew during the time of Moses when strangers, our English translation, wanted to attach themselves to Israel. What did that look like? And it happens these things were there, and they were part of what Moses required of the strangers. And I think I break that down as well. All right, so let's not overload them. Instead, let's write to them they abstain from the 4. And here's the reason. Because The word is G-A-R. I've got it there highlighted in yellow. That's the Greek word gar, G-A-R, because Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath. And I've seen some twisting and shouting on trying to get this to not say what it says in some of the Christian commentaries I've read. But easily defeated when we start to analyze the text from the Greek background. But anyway, I am going to share about Freiberg here. This is his definition of gar, conjunction, basically introducing an explanation, expressing cause or reason for, or the word because. So in essence, what Freiberg is saying is that you would use this word when you have made a statement and now you're expressing why you made the statement you made. And that's what we have here. Let's only require them to do these 4 up front. And the reason I only have to do that is because verse 21, Moses is being read in the synagogues every Sabbath. Now, you know what this requires? It requires that you have to be in the synagogue every Sabbath to hear him. Another interesting discussion, which we touched on in my last teaching on this broadcast. All right, the decision pleased James. Look at this. I want you to look at this. I've got the verses at the top, 22, 28, 31. The decision to do this pleased James, the apostles, the elders, the whole ecclesia that was present in Jerusalem, and the Holy Spirit. Wow. Okay. Paul and Barnabas were present at the reading of the letter to the ecclesia in Antioch, and upon the hearing they rejoiced for its encouraging message. Sounds like they were okay with it. There are other textual issues with this chapter and 21, which I said I'm doing tomorrow in my assembly, that we will take up as we make our way. We're going to discuss covenantal nomism. And the key for me in understanding this is, how does the Joshua-Rahab event answer the Gentile question in Acts 15? All right. So here's my conclusion. There's a whole lot to look at. We need to take it in bite-sized pieces, but it is not hard. And when you start to assemble this puzzle using the correct pieces, then the picture becomes very clear. And as I told the assembly when we did this, it's the journey. We're going to have a great time. We're going to go through and we're going to take a look at these pieces so that we can reassemble in our minds what the text is really saying, not what we've been told that it says. So important. All right, so that's the end of this presentation. This is, as I said, my introduction. I just wanted to set a type of foundation so that you would be able to, when I start to talk about something like, well, the Masoretic text says this, you know what I'm saying. And then if I says the Septuagint says this, you know what I'm saying. I want to have something that I can build on. So there you go. If you have questions, you can ask based on the slide number, and I can go to that slide and see exactly what the question was. There's also, I've been told, possibility that the PowerPoint will be made available probably on the main website. I don't know. I don't have all the details of that, but I do make it available on the website of House of David Fellowship. So when after a presentation, people can go there and download the PDF, and then they come back with questions. So that'll always apply. Anything that I do is always going to be available in one form or another. At our assembly, we have it available as PDF, audio, and video. All right, so that's the end of this. I guess I turn this back over to Don. Is that how this works? Don, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Well, what we do now is we open it up for question and answer and discussion.
Excellent.
So if there's anybody that has a question, I find it's very interesting. The last presenter was Mark Kaplan. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I do not know him.
Okay. He started life as training to be a rabbi.
Cool.
He then, you might say, he saw the light and was part of the Worldwide Church of God. He was in the college teaching Hebrew.
Wow.
And his presentation was the codes in the Masoretic text. And you could actually show if the text is genuine or not if it passes the code. And there's others who know more about how the letters mean certain numbers, and numerals are put together, and then you make the whole thing is just fascinating, and how you do those numerology actually matches up with the topic, and it's way over my head, put it that way. So
Very nice. Very nice.
a lot of history there. So any questions, comments, thoughts?
And I just want to throw in, while people are considering that opportunity, at least this works in our assembly, is that some of the people do not ask their question during the Q&A that's at the end of a presentation. Some of them want to meditate on it, and then they send me an email with a question, and then I share the answer back with them, or whatever, maybe it's something that needs to go before the assembly, but I don't want people to feel that if they don't have the opportunity to ask a question right now, that it can't be asked. That's not the case.
Well, if you like, you can put your email in the chat room.
Okay, let's see if I can actually do that. Okay, the thing is flashing. Let me see if I can do this. Oh, wait a minute. Come on now. There it is. Oh, okay. That's House of David, because the name of our assembly is House of David Fellowship. So I took House of David, and then of course .lm is my initials. So that is my active email that I use for the assembly. And so if a person wanted to look at this PDF and had questions, or they wanted to drill down to something specific, I could answer that when they are ready to ask the question. So just want to make sure they know that's available.
And of course, if you're one that doesn't like to talk, the chat room is available.
Oh yeah, that's true too. I guess that's a good option.
I see Mike Waters' mic is unmuted.
Oh. Okay.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, he is unmuted.
Yes. Well, you kind of found a little bit of a den of textual criticism here.
Okay.
I've been fairly much involved with textual studies on a fairly intensive basis for about 20 years now.
Wow.
So the first question is, out of the 10,000 different Greek texts of the New Testament and the 60,000 variations found within those 10,000 various, differing Greek texts, which Greek text of the New Testament do you go by?
If only that was true. Okay. The base text that I use is Nestle Aland 28, but within my Bible software, which is BibleWorks, I have the ability to look at all of the variants of all the manuscripts that exist for that particular text. And so when I'm doing a study and I have to deal with a passage, I will look at those variants to determine whether or not there's anything of a significant nature that needs to be addressed. And I will say that so far, most of the time, it's a minor thing. It's rare that it is significant. Every once in a while, something pops up here or there that's significant. Most of the time, NA 28, and I used to use 27, have worked for me. But even, I have to be honest, there are certain things that even that editorial group is supposed to do that they don't do. Do you remember in this presentation, I stated that from the standpoint of the Hebrew text, the printed editions make changes from edition to edition and they don't tell you the changes. Well, that happens in the Greek text as well, but unfortunately, it happens at an even lower level, which is the actual text, such as Nestle Aland. And so they're supposed to put it in the apparatus that they made a change, and sometimes they don't. And that gets exposed, and then that becomes a problem. So I'm going to say that I'm currently using 28, and from time to time, I have to consider other variants. They rarely are significant for the things that I'm working on.
Yes, I've had a little problem with that text because there's several thousand words less in that text than there are in the Greek, you know, what we would call it. Well, the received text would be not even old enough, the majority text of the, you know, the Orthodox Greek Bible.
Uh-huh.
And so if you look at that, what kind of prompted my study of the New Testament texts was learning about the Westcott and Hort project,
Yeah.
which led to the, you know, the modern, and so in my previous Bible program, I had a PC study Bible program. I could toggle between the received text, which isn't the original majority text, but you know the received text was a later text, more for the Western European people.
Mm-hmm.
And but in well, here's a little story if you can take a minute to listen to a story.
Okay.
We went to the feast in Panama City, and a friend of mine who was a, you know, tremendous Bible studier just got a brand new Bible for himself for his feast gift. And it was which was it? It was one, you know, one of those based on the modern the Greek text, you know, since the last 140 years or whatever. And I challenged him. I said, well, you know, that Greek text has about 5,000 or 6,000 less words than the majority text. And one of the key ones, you know, I told him the history of how it came to be, that it was put together by spiritualists in Oxford in the late 1800s who didn't even believe, you know, they were witches. And so they weren't really Christians,
Mm-hmm.
but they were Greek scholars, you know, had a very intensive interest in spiritual things. And but he got very upset. I mean, he was viscerally angry all feast. He just couldn't get off that subject. So I said, okay, you go home and you take a pattern of 2 words, and no, 3 words, and look at all the variants between the majority text and I you know, and I don't know which version of the Nestle Aland that was behind the one that he had, but the words were Lord, Jesus, and Christ. And you take all of those words and you know, look them all up, and he did that for 8 hours, and he threw his new Bible in the garbage can. His brand new Bible.
Oh my goodness.
And he began much more intense. He was kind of on and off with work, and I was, you know, working too many hours. And he just, I mean, we just talked for months, and, you know, even a year or two just on that subject of all the things he was learning. So, you know, and we look at it, I think we were taught that the canon as we know it was that every word is, you know, divinely breathed scripture and has been preserved without error. And so that's why I asked that question first off, because I'm kind of the opinion after studying this all these years that the Greek New Testament, you know, it really is. There's 10,000 versions of it with 600,000 variants. And so how do you go through? And I mean, you got to look at the footnotes and the translator's footnotes that were added in, you know, like with women speaking, that was actually a translator's footnote that was later added in because they weren't sure if it was there originally or not. And, you know, and all those things, John chapter 8, you know, you can go through all the different things, and I kind of feel that the whole New Testament really isn't scripture. It's a collection that was kept by the Greek churches of Paul's letters, you know, etc. And I've done a fairly extensive study of the Aramaic New Testament, and that's pretty old, but that they only started out with the Gospels, you know, and then there's 3 witnesses from the early years, as well as textual witnesses, that the book of Matthew was originally in Hebrew. And so that I just offer up the question, and maybe you can clarify, but I just don't believe much of anything other than thought per thought in the New Testament. You know, not word for word. Sounds maybe heretical, but
Okay, when I think I'm going to need a definition of the difference between word for word versus thought for thought.
well, see, a paraphrase, you go thought by thought, and now,
Okay.
like the difference between, say, the Greek grammar and Hebrew grammar is it's 2 different types of grammar.
Yeah.
And so to translate a Hebrew thought into Greek, you got to switch the grammar around. And because it doesn't translate word for word, just like
Right.
Hebrew doesn't translate into English word for word, it looks like, you know, you're talking to Yoda or something.
Yeah.
And so now, if you look at the Aramaic Targums, and I compare, say, the Aramaic Targums with the Greek Septuagint as well as the Masoretic, and pretty much everything I study now. But another thought I'll throw in is I've done a fair amount of study on the Samaritan viewpoints. And see, the Samaritan's Torah is actually in the original Paleo Hebrew. It's not even translated to the Aramaic block text,
Yep.
and has no Nicodim, you know. And so I'm actually even, you know, comparing that side by side. And but you know, but the thing that I just posted a post on this today on Facebook for another subject, is that the closest language to Hebrew is actually scientific notation.
I hadn't heard that.
And yeah, and I put it on another thread that nobody else is on, with some actually flat earther people. We're trying to, you know, take the English translation literally. And but that's really fascinating when you get like into the, you know, the numerology and the, as well as the, you know, the root words. And the messages encoded within the Hebrew, if you look at it as a, you know, like say H2O is a scientific notation way of saying water. Well, H2O tells you that there's a hydrogen, in fact, that there's 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. The word water doesn't tell you anything about the structure of what you're describing. It's just a symbol used, you know, for something we all know. But scientific notation actually shows you, well, there's 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. And that's the way Hebrew is in comparison to Greek or English. So I'm not sure that, I'm kind of seeing where you'll pop up with, uh, that, I guess, but, maybe I'm too skeptical, but I really don't, I only use the Greek part as a paraphrase because it doesn't match, say, the Samaritan or Hebrew Torah either way, partly because of grammar and by the same thing, I exposing myself here, but the only part of the Bible that I think is God breathed is, and preserved accurately is Torah. And that's based upon the symmetry, the beyond human symmetry of it. So maybe I'm just too much of a skeptic on languages.
It depends on where you're trying to go. See, I'm not interested in doing analysis of Greek or Aramaic or Hebrew. I'm interested in looking at historical references that far exceed the biblical record to see if I can reconcile things that took place and their implications for us. Of course, I always go back to Torah for that, and I'm in the Hebrew to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that 99% of what I do has nothing to do with the analysis, spending 8 hours of analysis with languages line by line. I would never do, because I'm trying to equip an assembly to be able to understand what happened in the first century so they can live their life. They're not going to go to that type of analysis. They're barely going to open their Hebrew. Yeah, I have a Hebrew teacher in the assembly, but it's very slow going. So I have maybe a different mandate than you have in connecting the dots for the people so that they can learn how to walk and what does love your neighbor actually look like in life. And it never gets into those types of discussions because it doesn't matter whether you think the prophets are not inspired or the prophets are inspired. What matters is when the opportunity presents itself. This is what I tell my people. If the opportunity presents itself for you to love your neighbor, do you do it or do you not do it? Doesn't matter what you believe, what you think, how you feel, whether they hate you or not. It's whether you do it or you don't do it, and what should that look like? So I think that while I hear all the things that you're saying, and somebody has to do that analysis at the heavy lifting level. I totally agree with that, and I have the scholars that I use for that. It's nothing that I would ever do because it's just outside of my mandate. I have a very narrow, focused mandate on equipping the people. I've got between 15 and 20 families that come to fellowship, and my mandate is to equip them and help them understand how to live today that makes it line up with Torah. And I use a piece of textual criticism now and then to get people's attention. So I'm really not putting the focus on it that you are. You are kind of like in that scholarly realm, and that's not where I'm at.
Okay. Yeah, because and I like to triangulate with history. In other words, I study a lot of ancient texts.
Mm-hmm.
And and that's the thing. I think you need to triangulate exactly what you're saying. You need to look at it from the thought by thought level, which is I think what you're doing is to get into the concepts. And the deep scholarly stuff would be, say, to verify. Say if you come to a loggerhead, well, you need to look at the scholarly side to verify. Well, who's saying, who's the right one if there's a disagreement. And but then to put it into a motion, of an action step that people can go to and.
Yep.
Yeah, well, then I kind of got where you're coming from. Very good.
Okay, well, that's good to know that I'm explaining myself well.
Yes.
I love the stuff that you're doing. I just haven't been called to do it myself. You know, listen, let me just say, we're finishing up 7 years here in Virginia. And I was in my ivory tower studying, no assembly. My wife said, you know, you need to start an assembly. I'm like, that ain't going to happen. No, really, you need to start an assembly. No, I don't want to start an assembly. And finally, she broke me down. So we started an assembly. And there was a whole lot of stuff that's going on I didn't sign up for, I thought. It was always so much fun to stay in my ivory tower, and she would be in her office, I'd be in my office, and we'd be studying all day on Shabbat, and then we'd come together. I'd be running down the hall, hey, look what I just found, and she'd come running in my office, hey, look what I just found. It's not that way anymore. It's what is going to be, when I have to present something, what am I going to say to the people that they're going to be able to take away and go, you know, I understand that. I see that. I know how I would apply that in my life. This is good. That's what I got to figure out. So I just don't get to have the fun that you get to have at this time.
Yes, actually, I was kind of given the mandate, like you say, about 20 years ago now to be doing the, you know, to really study the Word. And
we need those people. We need those people who get that call. They need to be in the assembly sharing that part, challenging the people's, especially those people that like to stay in the comfort zone. Yeah, challenging that on a regular basis so that it forces us to engage with the text and the culture and the history, and everybody brings their part. We've got to have those scholars. There's so few of them that are doing the job that you're doing.
But then you need to put it into, see it. And now, and I realize this, I'm talking to a group of, and I'm trying to be very nice and respectful, but I'm talking to a group of people that believe the earth is flat based upon the English language translation of the old, you know, the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and I understand that, but, you know, when I tend to notice when I put in something, you know, about a technical point, it's water off a duck's back. You know, there's no grasping, and so now, so what I'm trying to do is trying to find a connecting point with people that are not analytical, that take things like at face value as it hits them, because that's my challenge. So I'm working on that, is to work with communicating with people at a level that they connect with.
That
And
you have to do that. Otherwise, you're just, it's almost like talking over their head. Even if you're not, it's almost like it is.
It is. And now, so I'm like trying to be as nice as I can and to throw a thought out. But I notice if I get into, you know, say any meat and potatoes, I mean, it's like there's, I mean, no recognition even of what I said because they don't want to touch it.
All right, let me offer this perspective. I hear what you're saying, and I had that problem early on too. One of the things that changed for me was the establishment of relationship, and let me just say that don't happen overnight. But the establishment of relationship, when they had an emergency, I showed up at the hospital for them, and when their son was born, I was there, and when their daughter got married, I performed the wedding, and blah, blah, blah. Over time, when you are in their life and all they're seeing is things that are positive, then when it comes time to discuss something, it's like, okay, well, let me say this. I don't see it that way, but can you explain this aspect of what you're believing? I need to see how you arrived at that point, because I'm not seeing that. Now I could be wrong, so I need you to explain it. So let's get together. I'll bring the steaks. You've got the grill. Let's sit down. Let's go through that. 99% of the time, they're all willing to do it. It just takes a while.
Mm-hmm.
So you may not be able to do that. You may not have the time to develop that level of relationship. That's the only thing that's worked for me.
Yes, yes, and that's the thing. And so, you know, so I might offer up, you know, what might look like a correction, but as you say, it's so vast. I mean, it's just so vast. Like the challenges that are out there. I mean, I'm still really working on the first chapter of Genesis to get you know, to wring everything out of it that I can.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's a very slow going process, and I know that people have spent volumes working on it. More power to them. Now, if they could just put it in an audiobook, I could listen to it.
Yeah, you know, and like you say, everybody has learning styles too, and you know, my friend Jerry Allen, you know, we matched fairly good in you know, in ability to study, but you know, once he was challenged, he just dug in. And so sometimes a person responds to a challenge. Other times it's just, well, I trust you, and you know, it sounds like you know what you're saying, and maybe I should look at it different. And yeah, because you know, I would say perk up if I hear, say, the any of the modern texts, because I know who put them together, and I would question the axioms, you know, for why they use that, but as well, like you say, of the various Masoretic texts, because that was added. They added the Nicodim, you know, there at, you know, over the years, and that changes words a lot, you know, when you put in a jot or a tittle.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
you know, so it's it's interesting, and but a lot of people think that the disciples talked to each other in Greek. You know, I did years ago, and you know, then I came to find out, well, no, well, self-respecting Jew would talk Greek to another Jew, you know, unless you're doing business or you're talking to a Greek-speaking person, because they just, going back to the Antiochus Epiphanes era, they just hated communicating in Greek. And so, you know, if you look at the Aramaic New Testament, then you really see the idioms and the poetry and all that come out, because that's how they spoke.
Mm-hmm.
And but then, you know, you get into the early Greek Orthodox Church, and you know, and their transmission of the New Testament, and that's where, you know, okay, let's look at this. They had agendas, you know, the various groups, and there was a lot of division between the different groups within the Orthodox Church, and Constantine tried to bring some unity and order to it, you know, with the idea of having councils. But yeah, that's I mean, it's not the inspiration that I question; it's the transmission.
Well, I mean, the transmission is a key point. There's a fantastic book that I read that I shared with the assembly. It's called The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. And what it does is it shows how families of Greek texts in different locations and in different time periods, they would change the text to fight some heretical doctrine, heretical in their mind, doctrine at the time. They would change the text to try to fight it. And then you can see how the text after that particular event changed. And so the family was impacted by that. And then later on, another thing was done. And it breaks it down over the centuries. And it's like you sit back and go, these people just did not understand the situation. So all of those things are good. But you know what? I have found with my assembly, and this might not apply to the people that you speak with, but with my assembly, The textual criticism side, I really have to give them in small bites. There's other things in which they can take a whole steak, but the textual crit stuff, it's like I have to give them the size of a cat treat, or maybe
Yeah.
2 or 3. That's all I can give them in an assembly meeting, because that's just all that they can handle at the time. So what does that mean? That means it's going to be a long time. But, you know, here's the good part. I'm not on the clock. God's on the clock. He can call me away at any time. He can change the mandate at any time. But until he doesn't, I'm going to be here, and I'm just going to equip the people, and I'm going to throw them a cat treat every now and then.
Yeah, and you got the old Latin to deal with, but the subject I'm very interested in. I've been studying the ancient texts of the Eastern Church, not the Eastern Orthodox Church, but the churches that were east of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And there's quite a history going back to all through Central Asia and India, and even over to China. There were, and there still are, their churches over there where they follow, you know, very ancient liturgies, and they have their, you know, their copies of the writings handed down and all, and you know, and that's the whole totally neglected part, because we just look at the Greek and the European, of course, because that's our heritage. But
Are you writing these things for people? Are you publishing them in a public forum so people can see the research that you're finding?
little bits. I'm still such a so green behind the ears that, you know, maybe it's I feel of myself that way, but yeah, I put it together in Bible studies, like the Friday night Bible studies once in a while, and pretty much put it in blurbs in you know, different forums.
Okay.
But as far as writing, no, you know, I'm very much learning yet, even after all these years.
Hey, listen, let me explain what that looks like. Whether it's myself, whether it's one of my people in my assembly, or I bring in somebody from the outside, these are my instructions. You're not teaching the people. You've studied, you've found some stuff, you collated it together, you've come in here, you're going to share with us what you found. That's called presenting. You're going to present your findings, and then at the end of that, we're going to ask you some questions, and we're going to get into an open discussion. All right, so if you are ready for that, well, then let's just get it on. But I'm not going to tell you, don't trust me. I'm going to present my sources, and I'm going to quote out the gazoo. But, and just to cover my butt, I'll take my sources and I will turn them into a PDF, and I will make them available so people don't even have to go to the library to download the journal article. But at the end of the day, you got to be accountable, and I got to make sure that I give the people something that they can grasp a hold of to be accountable with. So just, you know, want to make sure I don't leave without saying that.
Yeah, you don't want to make a statement that you can't take back.
Exactly. So if I'm presenting what I found, then, and you know, I tell people this is the protocol of our assembly is the mandate of Proverbs 18:17, which is the first one who presents something sounds right until the second one comes along and examines them. Well, hey, that's the name of this game. I'm going to present what I have found, and then it's open season.
Yes, and it sounds like you hit a lot of sources that I haven't even heard about yet, so it's all good.
That's why we get together and do things like this, because maybe I have access to sources that you haven't stumbled on yet. Certainly you have access to sources I haven't looked at yet. And so we increase each other. That's how this works. That's why I like it so much.
Yes.
Oh, Dan, Don, you back? Don?
I'm here.
Okay.
Sandra and her husband were having trouble with. Try speaking now. I think I got you unmuted.
Hey, Don, can you hear me?
I hear you, Jim.
Okay.
I was just seeing if Turley's mic was working or not. If you look in the chat room, you'll see their question.
Okay, let me open chat. And I don't see a question. I see your foreign language scribble at the top.
Oh, you got to scroll down.
I do?
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Scroll bar.
She wrote it private to me. Why?
Oh.
You
Okay, well, then
let's see here.
that would explain that.
Yeah, that would explain it. Don, we can't get our mic to unmute. Okay, I thought I manually unmuted them. Supposed to be something on their computer. Ask Lee if he's aware of the Hebrew Matthew. We learned from David Rood that, and he's used this translation of the book of Matthew.
Yes, I am familiar with all 12, and I have all 12 of them in my library at my home.
All right, Jim, we hear you now. Or we did hear you.
Billy, I had a question for you about teaching. You
Yes,
said
sir.
that you're not really teaching, that you're presenting.
Yes,
I'm going to say that I would disagree with you. I think you are teaching, but we're not used to true teaching where someone goes out and teaches, and they may not be right, and that it's a community that then learns together. That we forget about that still quiet voice, no matter how much you study. There may be a still quiet voice of God coming to you from someplace else, showing you something you hadn't thought about. Doesn't mean you're not teaching.
Okay, I see your point. I think what I was trying to get away from, I'll tell you what I was trying to get away from, at least one point of it. And once again, this goes back to my wife and I and the discussion we had prior to starting the assembly. And I told her, I said, look, if people come to the assembly meeting and check their brain at the door to find out what Lee thinks is true and walks out of the building, I'm shutting this thing down as fast as I set it up. Because the one guarantee that I give the people who come in my assembly is that there's something I think that's true, and I'm going to find out down the road that it ain't. And so if you're not going to be here to help all of us with your perspective, your studies, your understanding, then I don't really know how much value you're going to bring to this assembly. You can still be here, but I need people that are going to hold us accountable so that we can all continue to move forward. So that's kind of how I present it.
Yeah, but I'm just going to say, I had given sermonettes in the past, and people will come up and go, hey, that was a really good sermonette. I'd say, what did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? And you could see deer in the headlights, you know. And I'm like, look, I was up there teaching, but I was teaching so that we could have this conversation. That's the starting point. We get deeper by talking about this. And what happens is most people don't want the teaching because they don't truly understand what it's for.
Well, you know, there's something to be said for that. And I'd like to think that I am bringing my people along to help them with the application side, reorienting their thinking, things of that nature, providing them with opportunities to test out their new knowledge. I guess you could say that I'm saying the things that I'm saying because I want to stay as far away as I can from, listen, Lee's going to be speaking next week and he's going to tell us what the truth is. It just makes me uncomfortable.
And I'll agree with you, and I'm going to tell a story that I know I've told Don.
Okay.
We're sitting there in class for doctrine seniors at Ambassador College. Don Ward asked, what's the biggest problem with Ambassador College? And my hand is the first one up.
Oh,
And
really?
my wife, who's sitting next to me, puts her elbow into my ribs and goes, put your arm down. Now, I turn to him, and he calls on me, and he goes, you know, the biggest problem with Ambassador College is you don't teach your people to think. And he agreed. He said, that is our biggest problem. So I'm just saying, good teachers understand that if you're not teaching your students to think and grow, I went to a really good engineering school, and the best teachers that I had were the ones who took a look at certain students and go, you have the potential to be better than me, and I'm going to work with you because you're hopefully in the future going to be better than me. And that's not the way teaching is normally done, but that's the way I'm used to it. And when it's done that way, it really works.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, I look out over the people. I've watched them come along. The ones who have been with me for the 5, 6, 7 years, I watch them and I see how they learn. I see how they present. I always put them on the spot. I do things to do that, to challenge them. One of the things that, just as an example, in the Torah portion, which is one of our 2 sessions on the Shabbat, it's one thing to study this Torah portion, to be present in an assembly where you're one of the people sitting behind a table and you share when you put your hand up. It's another thing to study the text because you're going to be the one who's going to be moderating the discussion, and you're going to be challenging people's positions, their comments. You're going to be bringing up points they didn't consider. You study the text differently, and what I do is I put the people in that place. I don't tell them they have to do it. I say, hey, who wants to moderate next week? And if they choose that they want to do that, well, then come on. Start thinking outside the box and engage everybody. So, yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, but isn't that great if you have someone presenting something that they really want to present? You know they're going to be studying and enthused about it, and it gives you a chance to rest. When I was doing some teaching and it was like every week I had to present something for Sabbath, you get burned out. You want someone else there. Oh, and I think about these guys who are in this tradition that they have to present every week or they might lose control. Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, you know, I'm not in control. Listen, you guys want to kick me out? You'll only have to send one email. So, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I don't speak every time. Just so we make that clear, I do not speak every time. I speak. I get 4 months off a year. I think that's pretty good.
All right. Turley's asked once again, so do you think these Hebrew translations are useful?
I use them. What I like to do is I will look at the Greek of a passage that I am studying that applies to some topic. And if it happens that that passage is mentioned in Matthew, then I'll pull out my Hebrew Matthews and I will go through and see what they have so that I can consider whether or not it is valid that those Hebrew words were the words that the Greek went into. And of course, I'll do that by going to the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, and I will look at the Septuagint to see what they used. And that way I am able to have a reasonable weight of evidence that this word either is or is not the possible Hebrew word that was used and translated into the Greek. And then from there, I will explore the path of, well, let's take a look at the usage of that word in Tanakh, but especially in Torah, to get a better feel for what's going on. And then we take that and apply it in the New Testament Greek text. So to answer the question, when the opportunity presents itself, I am all over the Hebrew Matthew.
Any other comments out there?
Yeah, I had one. This is Jim. One last question for Lee. I did a lot of study in the 90s on this. That was a pretty big theory then. I haven't followed it much since then. Obviously, the early church fathers wrote that Matthew wrote his original gospel in Aramaic, and then the theory was he translated it into the Greek himself. And I personally subscribe to that. But the big theory back then was that he didn't write it in Aramaic, that he wrote it in Mishnaic Hebrew. It sounds like you've been doing some serious studying recently. I'm just wondering, is that still a theory that is standardly espoused? that it was actually written in Mishnah Hebrew?
I'm going to say that the majority do not support that. The minority does, but the majority do not. My personal position is that I don't know that the majority is going to ever give up on the original Greek New Testament, whether the evidence supports it or not. I've read Comfort's work and a bunch of others, and I feel like they are so locked into the Greek text that they have completely lost the culture and heritage of the Jewish people in the first century and do not understand what these other things can bring to the table. It's almost like they don't want to hear about it. And I'm just being honest when I say I don't see change in their near future.
Okay, any other questions, comments? You know, I really, my opinion on this whole matter is that what we're supposed to learn, God has made sure that we get.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure if because I joined late, we had people over for our house. Do you believe that Acts was written in Hebrew or in Greek?
Are you asking Don?
I'm asking you, Lee.
Oh, my understanding is that through Acts through chapter 15 seems to reverse engineers into Hebrew easier, more smoothly than 16 through 28. That's what I have found. And so I'm not really ready to go down the path because we don't have any Hebrew versions in any existence that I'm aware of. So because I have to reach out to Protestant Christianity and I know where they stand on the issue, the responsibility falls to me to make the Greeks sing. So even if it was there, I'm not talking about an existence of a manuscript, even if it was written in Hebrew, I can't make the case to their satisfaction. So I do what I can with the Greek and line it up with Tanakh. So
but
where I'm at.
I personally assume it was written in Greek, but it was written by a Hebrew scholar who knew both languages, and he was trying to express Hebrew thought to a Greek audience. As Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles.
Yeah, I totally do agree with that. I never take the Greek on the face value of the Greek language. I'm always looking to understand if it was Hebrew thought being written in Greek, let's take it back to the Hebrew thought and figure out how that applies within the Hebrew heritage. I'm always on that.
I have one quick question, maybe not related to the presentation, but since we're talking the Gospels and some of the details, Lee, what is your opinion on the dating of the writings of the Apostle John? You know, the Gospel of John, the epistles, and then the Book of Revelation.
Well, I haven't studied that in a while, but a few years back that I did study it, there was a lot of things that seemed to point to a later date than an earlier date. I have not confirmed it because it was never a point of contention. To be honest with you, I really didn't care. Nothing ever presented itself into a position where I needed to care. It hasn't happened yet. I do follow the path that John lived past the first century into the second century and was active in the early part of the second century. Certainly, there is the possibility that he could have written something during those early years. Nobody seems to discuss that. So I'm wondering about that. But whether it was early or late, I'm not sure that anybody's presented to me a reason why one would be to be preferred over the other, since the evidence is so sorely lacking.
Yes,
well, I will say, when you say later, Lee, there's a whole school of thought that says it was written in 160 to 180 by the school of John and not by the apostle of John.
I had never heard that one. That's a good one.
Yeah, it's part and parcel of, they're trying to take the document theory and apply it to the Gospels and Acts, and liberal scholars basically say it was not written by the apostle John, but by a anti-Semitic group that existed in the 160s to 180s.
Wow.
Yeah, that's actually that's the more common understanding of when the Gospel of John was written. The only problem is there are actually shards from I forget where they found them, but of the Gospel of John that they date to the 120s, which kind of blows a hole in that theory.
Yeah.
But it's still taught. If you take a look in most encyclopedias that are written by liberal scholars, they'll date it to the 160s. Which is obviously horse hockey.
You know,
Let me just ask one question, and then by later you mean after the temple, rather than some people who say it was written before the temple. Yeah. What you mean by later, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Here's my position on those scholars. I have the Christian commentaries that I use when I'm doing a study. Like, for example, let's take the book of Acts. Throughout the book of Acts, I'm going to be quoting Christian scholars out the gazoo. The reason why is because I want the assembly to understand what's being said out there. And some of the things that are being said are positive things. I bring out the positive things when the positive things are said. And then when they try to make up a false narrative, I expose it for what it is. And I'm okay with that because it's a published public forum, whether it's digital, whether it's a book, could be a journal article, maybe there's some other things. Those are the main things that I use. I'm okay with what they say because I'm going to question it. I'm just not going to accept it up front and say, okay, so since these scholars are saying this, this means this. I don't do that. And so I know that they are out there, and I know there's some crazy and wacky things that get written. I understand that, and that will always be true in this age, at least. And it just doesn't bother me because it does not interfere with the path that I go down, and it never interferes with the application principles that I share with the assembly. So, yes, it's a shame it's there. No, it currently does not give me a problem.
No, but that's cool. Then I'm just saying, by later you mean 80s, 90s, early 100s versus 50s or 60s.
Right.
Yeah, I think you could see some all the way through all of the books of John that they're dated after the temple period, is when the Pharisees took control and they were developing what we now know as Orthodox Judaism. And you can see that he was addressing the issues that they were developing, and and as well as, well, why was he up in what we now know as Turkey? Why was he there? Well, it became illegal to be a follower of Yeshua in the land of Judea when the Pharisees took control. They heavily persecuted the Talmudi Yeshua, and their arguments were, like if for example, why does the Gospel of John focus on the deity, actually using the language of the deity of Yeshua, whereas the others, it's a little more, you know, it's not right up front. But why does he put it right up front in the face that you know that Yeshua was Yahweh, and that was being the issue presented. You know, that the rabbis like Rabbi Akiva and that were making it anathema that if you believe that he was you know, divine, you were subject to death underneath the rule of, you know, until Bar Kokhba, when they were kicked out of the land entirely. But, you know, a part of why John was up in Turkey was the Judeans, believers in Yeshua, were banned from the land. And you know, the Apostle Paul was gone. Well, why is the Apostle John taking care of the Apostle Paul's churches? That's one thing you look at after the destruction of the temple dating is, you know, well, those were, why would he be there when the Apostle Paul was there? You know, so you got little clues like that, you know, as well as his attacks against the Gnostics like Cerinthus and, you know, some of the others who were coming up with various Gnostic ideas. And so if you look at the issues and how they're addressed, to me that shows the dating of the writings of John, because it wasn't really the issue until the Pharisees took control of the synagogue.
Well, that is one of the ways you can judge dating. I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm just going to mention E.P. Sanders in Paul and Palestinian Judaism.
I
really
love that book.
covers.
I got the 1977 version.
I read it the first time in the early 80s in the Harvard Library. But also Dunn and Wright agree with him. And that's one thing I think that we sometimes lose in our historic perspective. I don't really believe John was fighting against Rabbinic Judaism, because Rabbinic Judaism was still forming at Yambia between 90 and 110. The Pharisees, the party of the Pharisees, not all the Sadducees were killed in Jerusalem. And if you read the Talmud, it says really clearly that they were disfellowshipping the Sadducees and chasing them out. So they had their own internal problems up until about 110. So I don't really think John was writing against Rabbinic Judaism. I think he was writing more against Gnosticism.
Yes, yes. It's all, well, the thing that in the Aramaic, if you read in the Aramaic, you see a heavy use of, you know, the concept of the Miltha and Memra, you know, from the Old Testament, the Targums, it was a concept of Memra, you know, which would be translated to Debar in the Old Testament or Logos in the Greek. And so he really drives that home to show the divinity of Yeshua. And then also the you know, bringing out that the disciples use the word basically that was used in the Targums instead of like we would know capital L-O-R-D or, you know, Yahweh, that that they use the same distinctive form when speaking to Yeshua that the Old Testament Targums used for Yahweh. That would be Maria, as opposed to Mari, or, you know, the various forms of Mar, and you know, the word for Lord or Master. And so the, you know, the instead of saying, you know, Yahweh in the Targum, they would use Maria, even as opposed to using Mari or other things. So there's a lot of messages in the book of John targeting, you know, debates that were, and so you just have to look back as to when that debate was being argued.
That's right. That's exactly what you have to look at.
Yeah.
So Michael, you lost me on a good part of that. But well, I'm going to go the Nag Hammadi. It was much more popular back then than I think most Christians realize. And
Yeah.
Gnosticism, with the idea of the demiurge, and that he actually, a far out God in that creation system created something physical, and the physical was bad. And I think that John goes back, that's why he says in the beginning, he points right straight back to Genesis, saying that no, the physical creation was not bad, it was good and it was right, and that Yeshua was part of that process. And that, you could talk about the divinity and other things, but I really think that he was concentrating more on Gnosticism being wrong. And that's what he was trying
Which
to
the key person was Cerinthus, who was in the area of Ephesus at the time of writing. Yeah, I agree.
You all do realize that this is outside the scope of my presentation series, correct?
Yes, I that's why I made that that concession when I brought it up.
All right.
But I did want your opinion on that, because that's something I've been looking at, and I appreciate Jim's input too, because that it kind of corroborates with what I'm saying, because we're aware that the preterists try as hard as they can to put John's writings before the destruction of the temple to make their theory work.
That is true. That is true. So
yeah, it's a definite side issue. Sorry about that.
no, well, I mean, I don't mind side issues after the on-point issues have all been covered.
So, Michael, the reason why I bring that up, and I think it's important, is you look at Paul's writings, and Paul said a slew of things. But I mean, the big thing that he talked about was that the Gentiles were now part of the people of God. I mean, that was his main message throughout all of his writings. There are other things that emphasize and de-emphasize that, but that was his main point. And that's why I think with the Gospel of John, his main point is that the Gnostics are wrong.
Yeah.
That Yahweh was the creator of all things.
Yes. Yes, and but part of the test with the Pharisees was they rejected any divinity of Yeshua. Also, that's why I brought that up. That's where they added an extra blessing to the 18 blessings, which is really 19, but it's actually 18 blessings plus one curse in the Amidah.
Yeah, it's the 12th benediction.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of controversy, but I personally think that the most likely time that was added was around 150. I don't think it was added around 100. I think it was around 150 or a little later.
Oh,
really?
that was when the whole Orthodox Judaism versus the quote unquote Christianized church all came to a head, where they went different ways.
Right after the Bar Kokhba War, and that's why there's a lot of debate about when it was actually added. But I think the weight of evidence really does go 150s, 160s, somewhere in that area, somewhere after the final destruction in 135, but definitely before 200.
But the Pharisees never accepted the deity of Yeshua. Never at all.
So, do we have any more questions for Lee? Getting back to the got a couple people in the audience that usually ask questions who are very quiet. I'm really wondering if perhaps their mics don't work or their fingers have been cut off and they can't be in the chat room. Wow.
Well, like I said, this was an introduction. We're going to get into the meat of things the next time.
So when do you want the next time to be?
Well, that depends on your calendar. I guess I could, do I have access to, oh, I do. I have access to the, oh, there it is. Stand by. Oh, there's the calendar.